Hello everyone, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today we are going to be ranking the episodes of the Percy Jackson show. I have been looking forward to making this video for a very long time. I know as the show was coming out, I was giving my reactions to the episodes and I was giving like my reviews and my breakdowns of each episode after they dropped. But now it's been about a month since the show has ended, which is so sad. But that means I've had some time to sit on the episodes. I've had some time to reflect on the episodes. I've had some time to see what episodes have like stuck in my brain and which ones have felt pretty forgettable in the past month. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start ranking the episodes. Before I get into this though, I do want to say I don't dislike any of the episodes. I think every episode has its strengths and every episode has its weaknesses. There's just some episodes that have more weaknesses than others, and there's other episodes that have more strengths than others. And also, of course, this list is incredibly subjective to me personally. This is just how I would rank the episodes. But let's go ahead and get into it. So coming in at number 8, last place is episode 6, We Take a Zebra to Vegas. Now, I really hate the fact that this episode is number 8 on my list because I did really like this episode. I also definitely liked this episode, I think a lot more than most people did. And this episode is not at number 8 for the reasons that you think it might be. I know a lot of people felt like, oh, the casino was really underwhelming. A lot of people were comparing the casino in the show to the casino scene in the movie. Although the casino scene in the movie is also incredibly inaccurate to the book, the casino scene in the movie is definitely a more fun and vibrant scene. Just in terms of, you know, they've got Grover dancing, they've got Grover surrounded by a bunch of girls, they have Lady Gaga playing, and a lot of people really latched on to the Lady Gaga part of that scene. None of that bothers me. I actually really adore the way they went with the casino scene. I love the casting of Lin-Manuel Miranda as Hermes. Honestly, I do. And I thought that he was beyond fantastic in this episode. I loved, capital L, loved seeing them go into the backstory already of Hermes and Luke's mom, which is stuff that we don't learn about until the 5th book if you're reading the books. But I love seeing them pull things from later in the books into earlier seasons. I really like that. I love the notion that the reason that Annabeth and Percy didn't really get distracted by the things in the casino is because they were together. I'm not a complete stickler for them creating a book accurate casino scene. I know a lot of people were super upset that we didn't get to see Grover playing his like wildlife game, like wildlife, like hunting humans or something like that. I think that's in the book. And then Annabeth with her architect game, I think is what happens in the book for her. I quite like the changes made to the casino scene in episode 6. So this episode is not in last place because, oh, they didn't make the casino book accurate. I actually don't care about that. I really liked what they did with the casino scene. I'd rather watch characters have meaningful conversations. But again, that's just me. That's just my personal preference. All that being said, I do think they could have gone a little bit more into the fun aspect of the casino for sure. If not with Percy and Annabeth because they were together, I do think we could have seen a little bit more fun coming out of what Grover was doing. During this episode, whenever it cut away from Percy and Annabeth and cut to Grover and Augustus, it lost me. I was not interested in that at all. And it felt really weird to be so uninterested in what Grover was doing after episode 5, because episode 5, I loved every time they cut to Grover and his conversation with Ares. So then cut to episode 6, Grover is split up again from the group, and every time they cut to Grover, I'm like, oh god. All right, let's go back to Percy and Annabeth. So that's a negative for me on this episode. I didn't really like every time they cut to Grover, and I'm sure the addition of Augustus will have a point, will have a meaning later on in the show. Like when it comes to Grover's search for Pan, I'm sure we're gonna be able to pull back to scenes with Augustus, and like I can tell they're setting up Grover and Pan very early on. They talked about Pan a lot in this season. That's not the issue for me. It just felt boring. That's the only issue. I was not bored with Percy and Annabeth talking to Hermes in the slightest. I think all 3 of them were incredible in their scenes in this episode. The Grover scenes were just boring to me. And that's probably why this episode is last. Also, episode 6 I feel like was just very short. And I actually don't mind the run times of the episodes. I don't want to watch 50-minute episodes of a Percy Jackson show. I know I'm probably like one of the only people that feels that way. I know one of the main giant complaints of this show while it was coming out was it felt rushed, the runtime was super short, etc. I feel like the The longest episodes of this show were like the perfect runtime. I'm talking like 45 minutes, including the credits. That was good for me. But like when it came to episode 6 was only 34 minutes, including credits. So realistically, the runtime of the episode is probably like 23 to 25 minutes. It felt really short, and I feel like they could have utilized their time a little better. I just didn't like the Grover part of the episode. So that part fell pretty flat for me. And because the episode was so short, there wasn't enough to like balance the part that fell flat out, if that makes sense. So coming in at number 8, we've got episode 6, We Take a Zebra to Vegas. Next, coming in at number 7, we have episode 4, I Plunge to My Death. Another one that it makes me really sad to have it so low on the list because, again, I really enjoyed the episode. Obviously, I enjoyed every episode. But I feel like episode 4 has a lot of the same issues that episode 6 has for me. It's really interesting that these two episodes are in the last 2 places for me because episodes 4 and episode 6 were written by the same person. I believe his name is Joe Trax. If I'm saying that right, I hope so. He wrote both of these episodes, and they are both my least favorite episodes. I think he is not coming back for season 2, and I wish him the best, but I think it might be for the better that he's not coming back for season 2. But episode 4, I Plunge to My Death. Once again, this episode is not in 7th place for the reasons that you probably think it is. I know a lot of people took major issue with changes in this episode. A lot of people tried to say that this episode didn't show any of Annabeth freaking out over architecture, which is, hey, that's just a lie. That's just a straight up lie. Annabeth definitely geeked out over the architecture of the St. Louis Arch. Now, things I liked about this episode, I thought Echidna was fantastic. She was scary. I liked the actress that played her. I thought that she was fantastic. I loved the Chimera. I am obsessed with like special effects and the creation behind these monsters in the show specifically. I have listened to the special effects people like talk about how they went about designing the monsters, and I find it so fascinating. And I think that the Chimera looked absolutely fantastic. And I love the scene where Percy falls out of the arch. I know a lot of people, at least on TikTok, were losing their minds that Percy falls out of the arch instead of jumping, because in the book, he jumps. And it drives me up a wall that people, this is why I can't take TikTok critiques seriously. It drives me up a wall that people are complaining about, oh, he fell, he didn't jump, boo. Hey, in the book, Percy jumps out of the arch because Rick was confused and he thought that the river ran directly underneath the arch. He thought that the arch went over the river. So Percy could see the water directly beneath him, and that's why he jumped. Obviously, in real life, the arch does not go over the water. The water is like a couple yards away. If Percy Jackson just straight up jumped out of the arch, hey, he'd be psychotic. He'd literally be clinically insane to jump when what is below him is pavement. That's crazy. So yeah, hey, they had to change it to him falling. And guess what? It looked great. The shot where it cuts away from him holding on to him falling and it's like a wide shot and it's silent. Oh, I loved that shot. That shot was fantastic. I don't have too many qualms, honestly, with episode 4. I think really just the main reason that it comes in at number 7 for me is because it's just short. Again, it's 34 minutes, just like episode 6. So it's about 25 minutes of actual episode, and it just went by really, really fast. Now, to be fair, I do remember when the episode titles got announced forever ago, like before the show came out, I made a video breaking down what's going to be in what episode, and I realized after we got past episode 3, like episodes 4, 5, and 6 are like one chapter of the book each. And I was like, it's going to be really interesting seeing them try and stretch a whole chapter of a book into a 30-minute episode of a show. And I feel like they did struggle to do that with episodes 4 and 6. They didn't struggle to do that with episode 5 because they added new stuff to episode 5, but we'll get there. So coming in at number 7 is episode 4, I Plunge to My Death. Next, coming in at number 6, I have episode 1, I accidentally vaporized my pre-algebra teacher. Which is crazy because I genuinely feel like episode 1, to me personally, kind of felt like a perfect pilot episode of a show. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree on that. And that's okay. We can have disagreements. That's fine. But episode 1 was just fantastic to me in my mind. I loved the scene with the Minotaur. I loved getting to meet Sally Jackson. She was fantastic in my mind. I think episode 1 was paced really well. I can't remember if people had an issue with the pacing of episode 1 or not. I think the pacing issue for people comes like later on in the season. A lot of people were trying to say that episode 1 was just like an exposition dump, which annoyed me, and I'll tell you why it irritated me. Within the context of the show, within the world of the show, Percy Jackson is finding out all of these things right now. He is finding out that he is a demigod at the same time as we are. He's finding out what a demigod is at the same time we are. He's finding out about Camp Half-Blood. He's finding out about the Mist. He's finding out about all these things at the exact same time that we are. So for Grover to sit in the car and to have a little speech for Percy about what he is, where they're going, what the Mist is, laying out a couple of rules in the universe for Percy, that is not an exposition dump. You can classify it as an exposition dump if Grover was saying all that stuff to someone like Annabeth. Annabeth, a character who knows all these things. Annabeth, who has been at Camp Half-Blood for like 5 years. If Grover was explaining this to somebody who already knew all the things he was saying, that's an exposition dump just for the audience. And that's stupid. But Grover is explaining all this stuff to Percy, who is confused and doesn't know anything, just like the audience. So that's not an exposition dump. An exposition dump implies that it's pointless. An exposition dump implies that it's done just for the audience, which is not what was happening. Someone had to explain what was happening to Percy. People were like, oh, it's an exposition dump. They're telling, not showing. How do you want Grover to show Percy what the Mist is? They did show it to us when we saw Grover with legs earlier in the episode, and then at the cabin we see Grover with goat legs. Hey, that's showing us the Mist. And then we see Grover tell Percy what the Mist is. That was not an exposition dump, and it made me so mad that people were trying to say, oh, it's just the whole show is an exposition dump. No, it's not. It's characters talking to each other. And also people were super complaining about Gabe after episode 1 dropped, saying he's not abusive enough, which is like a crazy complaint to have. People were saying that they girl bossed Sally Jackson too much. And the reason that people were saying all of this is because they were like, oh, Gabe's not mean enough, so turning him to stone at the end of the season doesn't make sense. And like he doesn't deserve it because he's not a bad person. Many things. Number 1, abuse is not always easy to see. 2, in the book, Percy doesn't realize that like Gabe is hitting Sally until the end of the book. And obviously they don't go into that in the show because, hey, also, The Lightning Thief was written 20 years ago. We as a society have been through a lot since 2005, I think, is when The Lightning Thief came out. I personally am more than okay with them making changes to the fact that Sally's not being physically abused, at least from what we saw. I think it was evident that Sally and Gabe are not in a healthy relationship. They are not in a loving relationship. They made that more than evident enough without making Sally physically abused. And that's fine. And the way that they had Gabe turn to stone at the end of the season was perfect for the Gabe that they created in the show. And I was fine with that. And it doesn't matter anymore because Gabe is out of our lives. He's stone now, so it doesn't matter. Oh gosh, also in episode 1, I just love Sally and Percy so much. You guys know this. I am obsessed with their relationship. I think that Virginia Cole and Walker Scobell have such a good mother-son relationship. It's just insane to me. The Minotaur scene I think is fantastic. The design of the Minotaur is super cool, and I think that they executed that scene really, really well. So yeah, I don't really have any negatives when it comes to episode 1. It's just every other episode that's ranked above it is just better, which is a compliment to the show, in my opinion. So next, coming in at number 5 is episode 2, I Become Supreme Lord of the Bathroom. This episode is where Percy is at Camp Half-Blood. We get the capture the flag scene, we get the bathroom scene, and this episode ends with Percy getting claimed by Poseidon and getting his cabin and all that good stuff. And I loved this episode. We get introduced to characters like Annabeth, Luke, Clarice. Such a fun time. Quite literally, the only complaint I have about episode 2 is that I wish we got to spend more time at Camp Half-Blood. And I know that that's a weird air quote complaint because realistically in the books, we don't really see them spend that much time at Camp Half-Blood. Like the whole point of the books is whatever quest the characters are going on. So we're away from camp for most of the books. I just loved getting to see everything at Camp Half-Blood. The cabins, I wish we got to see more of them. I think it's pretty fantastic. In the documentary, you can tell that they built all the cabins, and I think that that's so cool. I know a lot of the stuff for Camp Half-Blood was practical, like they made a lot of the set pieces and they like built them on site. One of the coolest things about the documentary for me was learning when they used a volume screen and when they didn't, because sometimes I feel like you can tell when they use a volume screen. Like, for example, the fight with Ares in the final episode of the show. Yeah, that's a volume screen and you can tell. Not that it looks bad, but you just know that it's a volume screen. But I didn't know that, like, in episode 1, when they're at the Met, that's a volume screen. I was shocked. I was gagged. I was like, there's no way. I literally thought that they actually filmed that at the Met, even though I knew that they didn't go to New York when they filmed. For some reason, I thought that they were actually at the Met, but no, it was a volume screen. And then I know Camp Half-Blood, a lot of it was on site in Canada, like Vancouver, I think, and it looked beautiful. And so the only thing I wanted to do was explore more of Camp Half-Blood. If you look, you can compare shots from the show to shots of the movie for Camp Half-Blood. And it's so funny to see like the vast difference. Camp Half-Blood just feels so small in the films, but it feels so big in the show. And I really appreciate that. Now, when it comes to episode 2, I know a lot of people had complaints about it because, hey, are you guys sensing a pattern? A lot of people had complaints about this show. People were complaining that Luke ended up being the one showing Percy around camp instead of Annabeth. I quite liked Luke showing Percy around camp because it really set up their relationship for the end of the show. I think that had really good payoff. A lot of people also liked to complain about the exposition dump that Luke gave to Percy when he was telling the story about Thalia. Now, I'll give you guys that one when it comes to the complaining about them telling and not showing. Would it have been cool to see a flashback of Thalia and Luke and baby Annabeth running up the hill fighting the Furies and seeing Thalia sacrifice herself for Luke and Annabeth? Yes, that would have been so cool to see that flashback. But you have to think realistically in terms of the fact that we do live in a real world watching a fictional show. Ideally, it would be sick to see that flashback, but realistically, they couldn't really cast Thalia that early, especially because by the time we get to the end of season 2, like 4 years will have passed in the real world, and that's like, there's no way that the actress who plays Thalia would have looked the same. So you have to think about stuff like that realistically. It sucks that we don't get to see the flashback, but just from a realistic standpoint, it's not an easy thing to show, because actors age outside of the show. That's just a fact. That's one of the things where I'm like, if you're going to complain about this, go read the book. Because when you read the book, like, you can imagine anything you want. If a character is talking about a flashback, you can imagine that flashback in your head. But other than that, I really enjoyed the capture the flag scene. I think that Clarice is fantastic, and I'm really excited for season 2 to see more of her, outside of Camp Half-Blood. I think that she's going to add a really fun dynamic to Percy and Annabeth and Tyson. Super excited to see him. And obviously, getting to meet Luke in this episode, I love. Genuinely, the only complaint I have is I wish I had more of it. So that's the bottom 4 episodes. And I use the term bottom 4 like very lightly because all of these episodes have something that makes them good in my mind. I've rewatched the show like 3 times at this point, and I'm not necessarily bored when I watch these episodes. I'm enjoying my time. I'm having fun. So this is nothing against these episodes. But now we get to move into my top 4. And to me, these episodes are mwah. So coming in at number 4, we have episode 7, We Find Out the Truth, sort of. This episode includes Krusty, Cerberus, the underworld, Hades, and I loved every minute of it. I really did. Now let's start at the very beginning of the episode, talking about Krusty, the whole Krusty scene. A lot of people had issues with it, and I will allow your issues to be had with the Krusty scene. Here's my opinion on the whole Krusty scene. I expected the Krusty scene to get cut from the show in general. It was really funny watching people complain that the Krusty scene felt very out of place and random in the show, because when I read The Lightning Thief, the Krusty scene in the book feels out of place and weird. It feels like a hindrance to the storyline and just kind of feels stupid when I read the book. Something I liked that they did in the show is they at least had a reason to go into Krusty's. In the book, I think the kids are being chased by like street thugs and they run into Krusty's to like find shelter or whatever, and that's where they get trapped and whatnot, etc., which is fine. And yeah, that's a reason for them to run into Krusty's, but it just felt like, hey, don't we have somewhere to be? Why are we adding this random scene to a book? But in the show, they had this like secret backdoor entrance to the underworld in Krusty's store. And to me, that actually gave the kids a reason to go into Krusty's, which I quite liked. I think the Krusty scene was super fast, and I know some people complained about that too, but I'm like, hey, if they spent any more time in Krusty's, I would have been like, can we hurry this up? We have things to do. We have to go to the underworld. There are so many more important things that we need to do right now than sit in Krusty's waterbeds and spend time here. Like, we don't need to be spending time here. I think the complaint that that scene was too fast is like wild. I'm good with it being fast. Let's get it over and done with. And of course, a lot of people had issues with the fact that Krusty didn't get his head cut off like he does in the book. And to that, I do have to say, hey, once again, take a step out of the show for like 2 seconds. You do have to understand that this is a Disney. Like, even the books were produced by Disney's publishing company. When it comes to adapting the show onto Disney Plus, when the target age audience is children, that's another thing that people tend to forget. A lot of us are in our late teens, early 20s. And there's even some Percy Jackson fans that are like in their 30s. I know that we read the books in like 2005 and so on when we were young, and we've grown with the franchise. So obviously we're still fans of Percy Jackson, but you do have to remember that these books are sold in the children's section of Barnes & Noble. If you go into a Barnes & Noble and want to buy a Percy Jackson book, you have to go into the children's section. These are not adult books, no matter how hard you want them to be. Even though they can feel very mature at times, they are children's books first and foremost. So the target audience of the books does coincide with the target audience of the show, which is still kids. And yes, as an adult, you can watch it, but you have to think about kids watching it too. So yeah, does it suck that Krusty's head doesn't get cut off? Sure. But the show does something that I quite like, where they at least acknowledge what happens in the books in a cute and fun way. Krusty gets trapped in the bed, and Annabeth says to him, dude, you're lucky we're letting you keep your head. That's funny. That's acknowledging what they did in the books while doing what they can with a Disney Plus show. But enough about Krusty. That scene didn't bother me. If anything, I would have been fine with it being cut out because I didn't really care for it in the book in the first place. I do think the guy that played Krusty, though, was great. He looks exactly like the character art for Krusty. Scary and skinny and looks like he's dead. I liked the underworld. I liked the design of the underworld. I thought that it was so cool. Like, Hades' castle is like upside down. I love all the production design in the show. You will never catch me saying anything bad about this production design, at least so far. I really liked Jay Duplass as Hades. A lot of people were torn on him as Hades, and here's my take on it. Number one, I think it was a very refreshing take on Hades to not have him be like the classic terrifying and evil Hades straight out the gate. I think it's funny that Hades felt a little fruity knowing that his son is Nico. Whether that was intentional or not, I enjoyed it. I also think that the Hades that we see in the show is not the only version of Hades that we're going to get. I think that when Hades walks up to Percy and Grover in the show, he is trying to be charming to them. The first thing he says to them is, hi, welcome, can I offer you some pomegranate juice? Which is literally trying to trick them into staying in the underworld forever. I think that it was a facade. It was like a nice and charming facade to try and get whatever he wanted out of Percy and Grover, because the minute that Percy mentions Kronos, the facade drops a little bit. Hades gets very serious for a minute, and he's like, ask me for sanctuary. And I think as the show progresses, we're going to see the more serious and terrifying side of Hades. But I think that he was charming on purpose in this episode specifically. But yeah, for me, episode 7 flowed really nicely. I had a really fun time with it, and I liked everything that I saw. I liked the addition of the Fields of Asphodel. I thought that was super cool. I think that that was added to make Annabeth seem like she was going to be the friend that was going to betray Percy, because we tend to forget a lot of people were watching this show that didn't read the books. So they do get to play with that, and they get to add things that would throw off non-book readers. So I thought that that was an interesting touch. So yeah, episode 7 comes in at number 4 for me. Moving on to number 3, surprisingly enough, is episode 3. I cannot get over how much I loved Medusa in this show. I thought about this episode for weeks after I saw it. I gushed about it in my review of it. I just loved it so much. I loved the way they went about Medusa. They didn't just make her a villain. They really leaned into the aspect of, like, in Greek mythology, it's not all black and white. There's so much gray in the middle of it. It was so interesting seeing Medusa talk to Annabeth, child of Athena. It was so interesting how the show chose to depict Athena, and I say that as a child of Athena myself. I may not have had fun with it, but it was really fascinating seeing them show that, hey, Athena, and therefore all of the gods, are not these perfect beings. It was interesting seeing Medusa interact with Percy, a child of Poseidon, really going into the story of Medusa and Poseidon and Medusa and Athena. I just loved it so much. And then getting the first half of that episode, almost feeling bad for Medusa. You start to feel sympathy for Medusa, this character that in all media is just depicted as straight up evil. You kind of get to see a human side of her just for her to turn and be the Medusa that we know and try and, like, turn Percy and his friends to stone. It was just great all around, and I really liked it. I loved how episode 3 really helped set the foundation for the friendship that Percy and Annabeth are going to have before they evolve to these characters that are, like, in love with each other. I loved the change of putting Annabeth's hat on Medusa and then cutting her head off. I thought that that was such a smart and inventive way to do that, because in the books they just put a bag over her head and then cut her head off, which is, like, you know, kind of boring in a way. Not only is using Annabeth's hat inventive, but it's also an ingenious way to get around beheading somebody on a Disney Plus show. So I thought that was pretty genius, and I liked that quite a lot. I just loved Medusa in this episode and the way they went about Medusa, and I also loved the development of the trio in this episode. Percy and Annabeth not really being friends, Grover having to step up and tell them, like, hey, you guys need to figure this out because we are not going to complete this quest if you guys are acting like this. The consensus song I found so funny. It was a really cute callback when Percy started doing it. And of course, at the end of this episode, we get to see Hermes for the first time, which was crazy. I did not expect to see Hermes this early in the show. It was a very pleasant surprise. And yeah, episode 3 was just an episode that really stuck in my mind weeks and weeks and weeks after I saw it. I don't have any negatives when it comes to episode 3, honestly. Yeah, so it comes in at spot 3 for me. Trying to figure out what episodes I wanted to put at spots 1 and 2 was actually very hard, because these last 2 episodes of the show that I'm about to talk about, I love them both probably equally, and they both have things that I could just talk about forever. And quite honestly, their spots could be very interchangeable depending on the day, depending on my mood, but this is just what we're gonna go with today. So coming in at spot 2, we have episode 5, A God Buys Us Cheeseburgers. I loved this episode so much. I know so many people were irritated that they changed what they do inside the Tunnel of Love. I don't care. I don't mind that at all. I know that people were excited to see, you know, them get broadcasted to Mount Olympus, etc., etc. I will gladly change that for what we got with Percy and Annabeth. This episode developed their relationship and their friendship so much, and it was so beautiful. And I think the acting from Walker and Leah in this episode was so fantastic. Walker and Leah were incredible standouts in this episode, and that's saying a lot because I enjoyed everything in this episode. But their acting in the whole Golden Throne scene was just so fantastic. Such raw emotion coming out of literal 12-year-olds, or maybe they were 13 by the time they filmed this, I don't know. But very talented acting, in my opinion, out of this episode. I know that there are certain scenes throughout the season, and there are certain line deliveries that feel like, okay, you know, that kind of felt like you were just reading straight off of a script. And I definitely think that's normal when it comes to child actors. Not every line delivery is going to be perfect, but episode 5 was phenomenal. Episode 5, I think they knocked it out of the park. I can't say enough good things about them in episode 5. I also really loved that we got to meet Hephaestus in the show. Timothy Omenson playing Hephaestus, I think, is such fantastic casting. I actually got to meet him recently at a Comic-Con earlier this month, and he was so nice, and I got to talk to him about Percy Jackson, and this is after Percy Jackson got renewed, and he seemed really excited about it. I told him that I loved seeing him as Hephaestus, and that I hope to see him more as the show goes on. And he seemed really excited about the show getting renewed, so that was super awesome to get to meet him. But I think he's fantastic as Hephaestus. I liked getting to see Hephaestus have conversations with a child of Athena and a child of Poseidon. I talked about this on my TikTok, but like Hephaestus's relationships with Athena and Poseidon make this scene of the three of them so much more interesting. Hephaestus and Athena both do not like Ares. They both have their reasons for not liking Ares, and they have that in common. We also know that Hephaestus has a soft spot for Cyclopses, whatever the plural of Cyclops is. We know that Hephaestus has a soft spot for them, especially Tyson. We see that in the books. And we also know that most Cyclopses are fathered by Poseidon. So it's just cool to see Hephaestus have conversations with a child of both of those gods. I really thought that was interesting. I loved the new trap that they did in the Tunnel of Love. I loved Annabeth's speech. Oh my gosh. Annabeth's speech moved me to tears. Leah Jeffries was fantastic in that scene. She was just great. She was just so good. And just when you think there's nothing more to praise about this episode, hey, we need to talk about Ares and Grover, because that was such a cool addition to this scene. In the books, Grover just like waits outside the Tunnel of Love and flies them away after they get out. That's such a boring use of Grover. Grover is such an interesting character, and they utilized him so much better in this episode than they do in the book. I can't tell you enough how much I loved it. The whole concept of Ares being so stupid was so evident in this episode. And Grover knows that, and Grover was using that. Satyrs are incredibly strong empaths, which means that they're able to read people super well. And we see that in how Grover is able to read Ares and play into Ares' ego. It was just really good, okay? It was just a really good episode of TV. Arian was great as Grover. I loved the scenes with him and Ares. I really, really loved them. Because like I said, in episode 6, which is at the bottom of my ranking, anytime it cut to Grover and Augustus, I was bored out of my mind and I didn't care. In episode 5 though, every time it cut to Grover, I was like, okay, here we go. Grover's going to do something awesome, and he did. I loved the way that those scenes were shot when it's like head on, when Grover is like tricking Ares pretty much. And the minute that Ares figures Grover out, the camera changes to like above their heads. Oh, it's just so good. And also, I have to talk about Adam Copeland as Ares. He was such a standout for me in this entire show. Honestly, I think that he was just phenomenal casting for Ares. Before the casting ever came out, I shared on Twitter what my personal fan casts were for like all the gods. And my fan cast for Ares was John Bernthal. And Adam Copeland acted Ares in the exact same way that I had pictured John Bernthal acting Ares in my head. So 10 out of 10 for Adam Copeland. I thought that he was just beyond fantastic, and I can't wait to see him more as the show goes on. Now, last but obviously not least, coming in at number 1 on my episode ranking is episode 8, the finale, The Prophecy Comes True. Now, does it feel pretty basic to have the finale of the show as my number 1 spot? Yes, it does. Is it predictable? Yes, it is. But I don't care. Episode 8 was so fantastic. I haven't stopped thinking about it since it dropped. And I mean that wholeheartedly. Starting out with the fight between Percy and Ares. Wow, I loved it so much. Something that people were heavily critiquing throughout the show before episode 8 came out is that they felt like the fight scenes were very limited. They felt like there was no action, which I think is kind of crazy, but that's just me. Like for example, Percy fighting the Chimera on top of the arch. I thought that scene, the fight choreography in that scene was great for what it had to be. You're on top of the St. Louis Arch. You don't have a lot of room. And also Percy was dying. So that fight scene being limited makes sense. I also felt like all of the fight sequences that we had so far in the show were smaller on purpose because we were saving the whole like, this is Percy Jackson moment for the fight with Ares. And that's absolutely what they did. Watching Percy drop that giant wave onto Ares was so fantastic, something that I've always pictured every time I read the book, and they depicted it beautifully. The fight choreography itself was so cool and so intricate. I loved it. I especially liked seeing Ares sort of do a sort of like wrestler slam of Percy. I thought that that was sort of a nice detail because, as we know, Adam Copeland is like a wrestler. So I thought that that was cute. But I could just watch the fight scene between him and Ares over and over again. I loved the fight choreography. I thought that it was spectacular. I also thought the volume screen looked good. I know a lot of people like to complain about the volume screens, and I'll give you that sometimes, you know, volume screens don't look as good as practical sets can. Like, filming on site is sometimes something that you just can't beat. But when it comes to a scene like the Percy and Ares scene, you're filming on a beach, there's just a lot of aspects to that where it's simply easier to film it on a volume screen. And I thought that it looked good. I personally thought it looked great. Episode 8 also had Zeus and Poseidon, which, oh my god, I didn't even talk about Poseidon in episode 7. Sorry. But I love the casting for Poseidon and Zeus. It's so sad that Lance Reddick is no longer with us because he was such a fantastic Zeus. I can't imagine them having to recast that character. More power to the person that's going to have to replace Lance. You have really big shoes to fill. But Toby Stephens as Poseidon, I can make a whole separate video talking about Toby Stephens as Poseidon. Y'all don't even want me to get into Toby Stephens as Poseidon because this video is already long enough. But I'll give you my brief thoughts. Perfect. He is perfect. He is the most perfect Poseidon that has ever Poseidoned ever. His scenes with Walker were just so incredible. Walker is fantastic. Can we just talk about that for a minute? I feel like Walker was made to play characters looking at their parents in a sad and longing way because he was just really, really good in episode 8. I loved the scenes between him and Poseidon. I am upset that we didn't get Poseidon saying your mother is like a goddess amongst women or something like that. That upset me, but I'm sure we'll get something like that later on in the show. Obviously, Olympus was all CGI because duh. Like the overall shots before they get up to the throne room. And I do think the CGI shots of Olympus could have been a little bit better, but I liked the concept of it, and I think it got the point across well enough. It's not like they had to linger on the shots of Olympus or anything. So yeah, I loved Zeus and I loved Poseidon. I liked how they changed that Percy missed the deadline. I think it added more to so much of the show. It added more to the fact that Zeus and Poseidon were literally about to go to war. So then when Poseidon comes in to try to like save Percy's life and he says, I surrender to Zeus, gods don't like to surrender. They don't do that. That's like not a thing. So Poseidon surrendering a war for his son, that was a really big thing for those two characters and for their relationship. I also thought that it was so cool to sort of parallel Percy and Luke in the fact that they both technically failed their quests. Even though Percy did return the lightning bolt, he missed the deadline and that was his quest. So technically they both failed their quests. And when Luke came back from failing his quest, he was treated as a failure versus Percy coming back from his quest and he is celebrated and he is loved. And I think that that dynamic is going to be explored more as we get into more of the show. But I just thought that that was like a cool parallel. And I feel like there's so much more that goes into that with like Poseidon intervening in things happening to Percy because he wants to save Percy versus Hermes not intervening in anything for Luke because Hermes knows Luke's destiny and he knows he literally can't do anything or say anything because he can't affect Luke's destiny. So much could go into it, and I could really write, I feel like, a dissertation about it, but that's not the point of this video. The scene when Percy comes back to camp, the scene between Luke and Percy where we get like the Luke reveal, I loved it in the show 10 times more than I did in the book. People were complaining about the fact that there was no scorpion. Hey, I don't care. I'm sorry. I think that it was better. It was so much better. And I feel like the show is not going full villain with Luke, at least not yet. And I think that that's so important because what Luke is fighting for in this series is supposed to really make the audience think. It makes the reader think. Luke's thoughts on the gods are technically right. Like, the gods are not the best parents and they do kind of suck. But Luke's actions are not something that can be justified. But then you have the fact that it's not just Luke, it's Kronos, and Kronos has gotten into his head. There's just so much to it, and Luke is such like a deep and insanely written character. You cannot view him on just a surface level. And I think that Charlie plays such a good Luke, especially in the scene where him and Percy are fighting. I also loved all the flashbacks in episode 8, seeing Luke teach Percy how to sword fight and seeing how Percy uses that in his fight with Ares and seeing how Percy uses that in his fight with Luke. Having Annabeth be there for Luke turning on Percy was crazy. I love the fact that Annabeth saw it. I think that that's fascinating, and I'm curious to see what that's going to do to her character later on, because in the books, Annabeth has a really hard time giving up on Luke, and she has a really hard time like sort of understanding that Luke has turned into a villain. So having her be there for Luke's betrayal, I think was really, really cool. And then you've got the moment where you think Sally and Percy are reuniting, and then they gag you and it's not, it's a dream and it's Kronos. I literally could not believe my eyes when that happened. When Sally was like, "It's time to wake up," I was like, whoa, what's going on? What's happening? That was a really good like gag moment. They did that so well. I did not see that coming. And I think it's really impressive that the writers of this show are able to make a book reader gasp. You're able to keep a book reader on her toes, and I appreciate that. I am more than willing to sacrifice some changes from the books if it means that I am going to have moments when I'm watching the show where I'm like, you know what I mean? Like, I know a lot of people went into the show wanting a book accurate adaptation. And when they say book accurate, they mean they wanted a 1-to-1 exact recreation of the book. And I really hate to tell you guys this, but that is not what book accurate means. But once again, that's another topic for another time. Long story short, I loved the finale of the show. I thought that it was 10 out of 10. It was great. I enjoyed every minute of it. Really fantastic. It had me laughing. It had me violently sobbing when the trio said bye to each other at Thalia's tree, and they're like, "Let's meet back here next year." Oh, had me sobbing really, really bad, actually. And I didn't expect to cry that much, and I did, and it was really embarrassing. So yeah, that does it for my ranking of the episodes for the Percy Jackson and the Olympians TV show season 1. We will be doing this again in like 2 years when we get season 2 eventually. But just to remind you, here's my ranking. Coming in at number 8, we have episode 6. Coming in at number 7, we have episode 4. Number 6, we have episode 1. Number 5, we have episode 2. Number 4, we have episode 7. Number 3 is episode 3. Number 2 is episode 5. And number 1 is episode 8. That's the ranking. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what your ranking of the episodes is down below. Let me know if you think my ranking is crazy, or if you think like, yeah, that's pretty much what my ranking is. Because obviously, you know, this is all incredibly subjective, and maybe you guys loved episodes 4 and episode 6, or maybe you hated the finale of the show. Let me know. I want to know what you guys thought. Like I always say, I feel like I could talk about the show forever, and quite honestly, I plan to. Stay tuned for more Percy Jackson videos. I'm going to do a tier list of all the characters. I'm probably going to do a video talking about all of the surface level critiques of the show, and obviously we'll be talking about season 2 as we get more information on it. But yeah, that about does it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.